Hello everyone, and welcome back to episode 2 of Prix Retrospective. And time for the moment we've all been waiting for, the Gordon Bennett Cup. Or rather, an alternative to it proposed by the French. Well, let's back up a bit. The Gordon Bennett Cup was an international motor racing event, first staged in 1900, designed to, quote, encourage automobile industries through sport. If you haven't already, for deeper analysis of the Gordon Bennett Cup and perhaps further context, feel free to watch the introductory episode linked in the description. The main ground rules of the Cup were as follows. It was a competition between nations specifically. The winning nation earned the right to host the following Cup, and most importantly, each nation was limited to 3 cars. In 1905, the Gordon Bennett Cup was, naturally, one of the premier racing competitions in the world, but it was far from perfect. This limit of 3 cars per country would come under fire in 1905 when it was the turn of France to host the Cup. Having one of the most dominant automobile industries in the world, the French manufacturers were dissatisfied that such a dominant country was forced to play on a numerically equal footing with the likes of Austria and Switzerland, third world countries, so to speak. Before the Gordon Bennett Cup, there was a session of the AIACR, the international governing body of recognized auto clubs, to be held. This body effectively ran as the United Nations of the car industry. In this meeting, the Automobile Club of France, or the ACF henceforth, proposed revised limits of cars per country in order to better reflect how well developed the auto industries were. However, because these were rather arbitrary limits, these attempts failed, and the French were forced to run with 3 once again. However, when the French would win on home soil, meaning they would host again for 1906, the patience of the manufacturers snapped. The ACF decided against running the Gordon Bennett Cup for the foreseeable future, instead running an alternative race with no limit on how many cars can enter the race per country, effectively being open to anyone willing to participate. However, the ACF couldn't just run the same race without the limit, otherwise there wouldn't be much of any foreign interest. They knew this, and to avoid it, the ACF went all in on making this race a better one. They would offer prize money that was nearly triple the amount offered in the Gordon Bennett Cup, 100,000 francs no less, and proposed that the race be twice as long, running across 2 days instead of 1. The larger sum of prize money was the main inspiration for the name of the race. After all, manufacturers are racing for 100,000 francs, a big prize, offered by the ACF. Or, in French, Grand Prix de l'Automobile Club de France. Colloquially speaking, this race would be the Grand Prix. The response to the decisions of the French were mixed, to say the least. Great Britain and the USA were unenthusiastic. Both believed that the Grand Prix was a silly attempt at French propaganda, citing newspaper clippings of a braggadocious French motoring journalist as part of their reasoning. As such, no British or American manufacturers saw any meaning in committing to participate. However, others would be interested in the Grand Prix. Rather importantly, the leading manufacturers of both Italy and Germany reacted very favorably to the event, citing the increased race distance and prize money as a major selling point. Love it or hate it, the Grand Prix is going to happen. With many local auto clubs within France scrambling to host the event, the Automobile Club de la Sarthe, based in the town of Le Mans in Pays de la Loire, would be the first to seize the opportunity. They devised a course that ran east of their native town, running in a counterclockwise triangle through farmland and forest. The circuit would pass through the towns of Saint-Calais and La Ferté-Bernard, totaling 103 kilometers, all of which now still stand today as public roads. Rather importantly, several sections of the circuit would be run on roads built out of wooden planks. Remember that. Being impressed with their offer, the ACF quickly accepted the proposal. The competitors would run the course of Le Mans for a total of 12 laps, across 2 days of 6-lap races per day, with aggregate timing determining the results. There were several ground rules for the cars themselves, obviously. Each manufacturer could commit a maximum of 3 cars, as in the Gordon Bennett Cup era, and each car was limited to a maximum weight of 1 metric ton, excluding all extraneous parts. And there was also fuel consumption mandated, and the substitution of drivers must occur at the end of a day's running, rather than during the race itself. So now the Grand Prix is fully set up. Interest for the race was naturally extremely high, with 12 manufacturers across 3 countries entering cars for the event. 9 of them were French, which included names such as Laurent Dietrich, Panhard and Darracq. Italy came with Fiat and Itala, while Mercedes would represent the sole German manufacturer in the field. Let's take a look at some of the most noteworthy teams in this grid and see what their objectives are. Alongside making robust production cars, Lorraine Dietrich are a team known for being consistent, if not distinguished, in racing. Their lineup of drivers today consists entirely of Gordon Bennett Cup veterans, the only team to have such a distinction. With the experienced Henri Rougier and the young, fast Arthur Duray, many eyes will be on Lorraine Dietrich to see if they can win their first major prize. Speaking of Gordon Bennett Cup, Brassier, the winners of the previous two editions, are easily viewed as the odds-on favorites here, having the fastest cars in the field. However, their champion lead driver Léon Thierry will not be in their lineup, as he is pursuing building his own racing car instead. With Paul Barrat as the new lead driver and Pieri as a substitute for Thierry, many will be closely watching Brassier to see if they can still win without Thierry. The French may not view Italian manufacturers as much, but Italians are ferocious contenders in the right conditions. Fiat are one of the best adjusted to the format of closed circuit racing, with their cunning and ingenuity almost granting them a Gordon Bennett Cup win in 1905 in French soil. For this race, they are no less serious, with lead drivers Vincenzo Lancia and Felice Nazzaro, as well as the agile, youthful German Aldo Weilschott, brought into the team upon the exodus of Alessandro Cagno. Can they beat the French in their own backyard? We'll see. With close ties to the ACF upon its founding in the mid-1890s, Panhard Levasseur assumed one of the most commanding leads over the French auto industry during the intercity racing era. However, the industry of motor racing is developing at a rapid pace, and the experienced Panhard Levasseur, while adapting well, are finding it increasingly difficult to maintain their place in the fiercely competitive French industry. Even so, with the American expatriate George Heath, as well as Georges Test and Henri Tarr, Panhard wishes to make a proper impression on the competition in this Grand Prix. One of the other prominent production car makers in this grid, Renault's presence in motor racing has been timid to say the least. After the tragic and harrowing death of one of their founding fathers, Marcel Renault, in the infamous Paris-Madrid race in 1903, Renault have rarely given motor racing much thought since. However, the Grand Prix is a perfect opportunity to restore the Renault name and put their manpower to good use. With former mechanic and Hungarian emigre Ferenc Sis as lead driver, let's see what Renault can do to avenge Marcel. Clément Bayard are one of multiple manufacturers in the Grand Prix grid who are not even remotely close to the level of success of Brassier or the resources of Mercedes. Like manufacturers Gaubrand-Brillet and Grégoire, this manufacturer is simply trying its best to make a name for itself. Thankfully, they've seen several promising results from their trustworthy lead driver, Albert Clément, which gives them a decent shot here. Other noteworthy entrants include Mercedes' two main drivers, Camille Genetzi, and organizer of the Targa, Vincenzo Florio, as well as the Darracq team, led by Victor Emery and Louis Wagner. With all 12 manufacturers entered, all 33 cars received, we are ready for the running of this new event. This race would be notable for having bookmarkers at the beginning of the circuit, gambling on who the winner would be, just like horse racing. Under this system, the drivers given the highest odds of winning the race were Fiat's Lancia alongside Darracq's Emery. Anyways, for the first day of racing, each car would be sent off in 90-second intervals at 6 in the morning on Saturday, June 26th. Each manufacturer labeled their 3 cars A, B, and C, determining the priority of each driver within the team. The A drivers would start first, followed by the B drivers, and later the C drivers. In front of the roaring crowd of over 2,000 at just the start-finish line, Lorraine Dietrich's Fernand Gabriel was intended to start first, as he was numbered 1A. However, his car stalled and he spent 5 minutes getting it fixed, which meant that Vincenzo Lancia would be the first to set off 90 seconds later. Lancia was then followed by Ferenc Sis, Victor Emery, Paul Barrat, and Camille Genetzi. One main elephant in the room for this race is that it's a hot midsummer's day in northern France, with temperatures reaching upwards of 39 degrees centigrade. What's for sure is that the astuteness of each riding mechanic will be put to the test under these arduous conditions. The same can be said of the drivers too, to be fair. French Itala driver Maurice Fabry was the quickest out of the flying mile before the first sharp turn, having done it in 43.4 seconds. However, on the approach to Saint-Calais, perhaps losing focus, he ran over a boulder, causing him to crash out of the race in just the first lap. With the crowds eagerly watching and cheering on from all across the track, by 6:40, word got round that the first lap was about to be completed. 15 minutes later, along came Lancia to begin his second lap, indicating to the spectators that his first lap was without incident. On elapsed time, however, the Brassier of Paul Barras and Lorraine Dietrich of Arthur Duray would reign supreme, putting in laps in the 52-minute range, boding well for their chances. If this were a race on merely speed alone, this race would simply be too close to call, as there are 8 different manufacturers in the top 15 after just one lap. However, this is a 12-lap race, so attrition is definitely at play here. One of the worst issues this race presented was the sweltering heat. As the day grew hotter, the newly laid road surface of tar would rapidly melt, which meant the course became less smooth over time. This does not bode well for tires, as punctures will occur often. This brings us into the Grand Prix's one major technical innovation, the detachable tire. There were 3 manufacturers of tire which supplied rubber to the teams in this race: Michelin from France, Dunlop from Great Britain, and Continental from Germany. Where all 3 had supplied conventional and trusted rubber to the teams, Michelin pulled a leg up on the competition by introducing a new type of tire, la jante amovible, French for detachable rim. The detachable rim effectively makes a given wheel removable from the car and can be replaced with a completely new spare wheel with inflated rubber in the event of a puncture. This process would simply take 2 to 3 minutes, saving legions of time that otherwise would have been spent cutting the blown tire off of the rim with a knife and manually forcing new rubber onto the fixed wheel. The detachable rim thus had a rough 12-minute advantage per puncture. That said, only 3 manufacturers took them: Renault, Clément Bayard, and the Italian Fiat, each of whom already have lightweight and nimble cars. We'll see how that affects them later on. Back in the race, during the second lap, a puncture would already affect Camille Genetzi, as well as Arthur Duray, each of whom lost 15 minutes replacing them. In addition, Vincenzo Lancia's engine would overheat at La Ferté-Bernard, forcing him to change his radiator at the Fiat service station. This process meant that he lost over half an hour of on-track time. After 1 hour and 45 minutes, Paul Barras maintained the lead in the second lap, but Brassier's substitute driver, Pierry, would put in a blistering 52-minute lap, putting him right behind in second place with a near 4-minute gap to Renault 6. With Brassier's cars in first and second, one could be forgiven for thinking that even without Léon Thierry, they'll run away with everything once again. However, disaster struck for Pierry on lap 3 after getting beached on the wooden roads and breaking his front suspension. Resolving the matter would take over an hour, meaning he'd rejoin well out of contention for any hope of winning the race. In addition, his teammate Paul Barras relinquished the lead when he suffered another puncture, which he moved quickly to replace, though he would rejoin the race in the 3rd position. It wasn't all bad for Brassier, however, as their 3rd driver, Jules Barillier, would put in a very quick lap, elevating him into second place, a mere 41 seconds behind the new leader, Ferenc Sis. At this point, several drivers have taken a conservative approach to combat the unstable conditions of the track, while others are taking a much more aggressive, fast strategy for the exact same reason. It was roughly 9:15 to 9:30 in the morning by the time people would begin their 4th lap, and by now, the temperature's effect on the road surface would be detrimental to more than just tires. On this lap, one of Renault's seasoned drivers, Jacques Edmond, drove along until something went wrong near Vibraye. He couldn't see anything at all, and it was because the melted oil from the tar road surface seeped past his broken racing goggles and into his eyes. Edmond's riding mechanic had little to comfort him with, since the rules forbade swapping out an incapacitated driver during the running, only at the end of the first day. This would mean that, unfortunately, Edmond would have to make it to the end of lap 6 blind before he could be replaced with a substitute. Similar problems would happen with Vincenzo Lancia and Camille Genetzi, both losing legions of time to incapacitated eyesight, though in Lancia's case, it was merely the goggles. However, it was on lap 5 where attrition would take a turn for the worst, as the melting process sped up dramatically with rising temperatures. The broken road surface would put Henri Tar out of the race, and Georges Test and Paul Barras would both be lapped and well out of the competition, after careening off the surface and spending an hour to get back on track. As a show of just how much attrition had occurred on lap 5, Elliott Shepherd and Felice Nazzaro were in the top 5 at the end of lap 4. On the next lap, they each had multiple punctures, and their lap times were more than 20 minutes off the pace, yet both were in relatively the same positions at the end of the lap. In the midst of all this, Ferenc Sis continued to reign supreme, extending his advantage to 27 minutes over now second place Albert Clément. Let's see who is using those detachable rims I mentioned earlier. Very interesting. These wheels will be extremely helpful for the leader, as even his day is far from smooth sailing. In his autobiography, he recalls having to change at least 12 punctures on just the first day of running. Fascinating considering all 5 of his laps so far have been quick. Despite massive perseverance, the incapacitated Jacques Edmond could not keep racing blinded by oil in his eyes, with the situation made even worse when officials disallowed him from replacing his goggles. Therefore, Jacques Edmond retired from the race. The end of the 6th lap marked the end of the first day's running, with Ferenc Sis finishing the day with a 26-minute advantage. Felice Nazzaro, the Fiat driver, ran a very conservative pace all day long, which served him well and put him in the 3rd position. When each driver completed their 6th lap, their car was moved into a floodlit park which the race officials would keep a watchful eye on the entire night before the Sunday of the 2nd day, to make sure no modification were made to the cars. This would be called Parc Fermé, French for closed park. There were 17 cars left to begin the 2nd day of racing on Sunday, June 27th. In order for the road position to accurately reflect the elapsed time of each driver, the time of the first day's running would determine at what time each driver set off. This meant that Sis started the race 26 minutes before anyone else, and since he had such breathing room, he immediately spent the first 11 minutes of the 2nd day changing the tires on his Renault, opting to start with fresher rubber. As planned, the incapacitated Mercedes driver Genetzi would be substituted by his replacement, the British Alexander Burton. Fiat's Lancia was also meant to be replaced, but his substitute could not be found in time, which meant that he was forced to take the wheel of his car in his street clothes. Not expecting to race, he hadn't prepared his race suit. Since more than half of the field is well out of contention for winning the Grand Prix, the main objective for those competitors is simply to finish the race. However, even with better conditions and knowledge of how this triangular circuit is acting up, that's easier said than done. After a 4th place finish on day 1, during lap 8, Hotchkiss's Elliott Shepherd would careen off of the wooden planked roads just outside Saint-Calais. This footage shows his attempts at reversing and getting back on track, which would take 15 minutes out of his time. Shepherd would continue, though later on in the lap one of his wheels split in half, putting an end to his race. That same lap, Darac driver Victor Emery would see his engine explode and his hopes of finishing the race along with it, after already experiencing multiple problems. It was the same fate that his other 2 teammates, Louis Wagner and René Anriot, had suffered during day 1. There was little that happened in terms of a battle for the lead, though, as Ferenc Sis continued to extend his advantage lap by lap, reaching 40 minutes by lap 9. However, Sis's rear suspension would break midway through lap 10. His mechanic recommended to him not to fix the damage and instead finish the race at a cautious pace, since their near full lap lead was almost insurmountable. Sis agreed, and they carried on at a reduced pace, roughly taking 20 minutes out of their lap times. Knowledge of Ferenc Sis's wounded car reached the service station of Fiat, who informed Felice Nazzaro on the last lap of his trouble. After taking over 2nd place, Nazzaro quickly responded by throwing caution to the wind in an attempt to slice into Sis's gap. However, 30 minutes was a tall order, and with Sis maintaining caution, Nazzaro's valiant attempts were not enough. At the end of the 12th lap, Ferenc Sis, Albert Clément, and Felice Nazzaro reached the finish line at Conneray in the first 3 positions, receiving a black flag indicating the end of the race. Renault and Ferenc Sis were the very first winners of the Grand Prix. The top 3 finishers were escorted to the grandstands to collect their trophies, where thousands were waiting to cheer for and congratulate them. The publicity of the victory would prove to be greatly beneficial to Renault, as they would magically see their production car sales nearly double by 1907, and triple overnight relative to the first half of 1906. As the old saying goes, you win on Sunday, you sell on Monday. Not to mention, Renault's interest in motor racing as a whole reignited after the success. Marcel surely would have been proud. The Italian team of Felice Nazzara would finish second, firmly establishing Fiat's position in the motor racing world as one of the fiercest competitors in the circuit, coming ever so close to victory in the backyard of the French. However, for automotive giants Mercedes, it was a disaster. 2 of their cars would finish the race, though not without pain and suffering among both of them, with all-around inconsistent pace and a litany of different reliability issues. Laurent Dietrich viewed this race as a disappointment, with only one finishing car in Arthur Duray. However, they would get their revenge in August later that year, with Duray claiming first place at the Belgian Ardennes circuit race. In that event, Duray and Laurent Dietrich did battle with several of the teams that participated in this Grand Prix, such as Mercedes, Darracq, Clément Bayard, and Brassier. In terms of the Grand Prix as a whole, while many individuals had viewed the Grand Prix as a successful race under its own merits, the media believed that in comparison to its predecessor, the Gordon Bennett Cup, the Grand Prix was underwhelming. They pointed to several reasons for this, such as the race being too long, drivers very rarely interacting with one another on track because of the staggered start, as well as riding mechanics having too much pressure by being the only ones who were allowed to fix the cars. No one could touch them at all. Nevertheless, the ACF would look on these setbacks as things to improve in future runs of their Grand Prix, which meant that after a striking first impression, this race was here to stay. I think, in retrospect, none of us could be happier about that. This concludes part 2 of this episode. Part 3 will resume for the 1906 Vanderbilt Cup in Long Island, New York, and it should premiere within the next 2 weeks. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you for 1906 Vanderbilt Cup.